The sun was a fist. It struck the Arizona desert, and the land offered nothing back but a shimmering wave of heat. This was the year 1874. The town, if one could call it that, was named Providence. It was a name that tasted like irony in a place that God seemed to have scoured clean of mercy. The town was little more than a single, wide street of baked earth. A collection of raw timber buildings huddled together as if for comfort against the emptiness. All around them, the world was rock and thorn. Mesas rose in the distance, flat-topped and crimson, looking like altars to forgotten gods. The vegetation was sparse, just the pale green of sagebrush and the skeletal arms of Ocotillo. This was the borderland, a place where maps gave up and stories began. The air itself was divided. It carried the smell of the blacksmith's forge and the sour tang of cheap whiskey from the saloon. But underneath that, it carried the scent of alkali dust and something wilder, something that blew in from the high desert. Society here was a simple, brutal equation. There were the settlers, the men and women who had come west with hope and wagons, only to find their hope baked into the cracked soil. Then there were the soldiers, the blue-coated men from the United States Army, stationed at a fort some 10 miles distant. They were a promise of protection and a threat of control. And then, in the hills, in the canyons, in the silence, there were the Apache, to the people of Providence. They were not people at all. They were a rumor, a nightmare, a force of nature like the flash flood or the rattlesnake. The clashes were constant, a bloody punctuation to the long, hard sentences of daily life. Clara Whitmore stood in this heat, her hands on a split wooden rail. She was 19 years old, a woman grown, though she rarely felt like the women she read about in her few treasured books. She was tall for a woman, and lean with the kind of strength that comes from relentless work, not from leisure. Her hair was the color of dust, and she kept it pulled back in a severe braid that fell to the middle of her back. She lived with her father, Jedediah Whitmore, on a small farm at the edge of the town, a place so small it was barely a farm at all. It was just a patch of stubborn defiance against the desert. She pushed the new rail into place, her knuckles grazing the rough wood. Her father's voice startled her, though he had only spoken her name, Clara. He stood by the cabin door, a man made of sinew and worry. Jedediah loved his daughter. He loved her with a fierce, protective anxiety that had only grown since his wife, Martha, had been taken by fever 5 years prior. He saw the world as a catalog of dangers, and his primary duty was to shield Clara from them. "That is not your work, girl," he said, his voice gentle but edged with the familiar disapproval. He was a man who believed in order, in tradition. Men worked the land. Women worked the home. Clara did not turn to look at him. She kept her gaze fixed on the mountains, which were turning a deep, bruised purple as the afternoon wore on. "The rail was broken. Pa, it needed fixing." "I would have fixed it," he said, stepping out onto the porch. "There is mending inside. There is the meal to prepare." "The mending is done. The meal can wait an hour." Her voice was quiet, but there was a thread of steel in it that he knew well. It was the part of her that baffled him, this core of resistance he could not seem to soften. He sighed, a sound of resignation. "It is not fitting. A young woman should not be seen doing a man's labor. What will people think?" Clara finally turned. Her eyes, the color of a pale sky, met his. "I do not care what people think. Pa, I care if the mule gets out." Jedediah shook his head. He looked past her, his gaze sweeping the horizon, a habit no one in this land ever lost. "Folks talk. They say you are too bold. They say it is not natural. A woman needs a husband. She needs a home to care for." This was their oldest argument, a well-worn path they walked nearly every day. Clara felt the familiar constriction in her chest, the feeling of a rope tightening around her. She loved her father, loved his steady, calloused hands and his tired eyes, but his love felt like a cage. He wanted her to be safe, which to him meant being small. He wanted her to marry. perhaps to Mr. Henderson, the portly owner of the general store, a widower of 40 years, or perhaps to one of the young men who tried to farm nearby, boys who were already turning into old men, their faces grim with the fight against the land. Clara wanted none of it. She did not know what she wanted, not truly, but it was not that. It was not the prescribed life of childbed and washboard and silent obedience. When she looked at the mountains, she felt a pull, a vast and silent call. It was a craving for something she could not name. It felt like freedom. It felt like a space big enough for her soul to stretch. This longing was her deepest secret, a guilt she carried. It felt like a betrayal of her father, of her mother's memory, of her place. Women were meant to be the hearth, the center of the home. They were not meant to look at the wilderness with yearning. The wilderness was the enemy. It was the home of the Apache. The tension in Providence was a constant thrum beneath the surface of life. It was a peace that was not peaceful, a silence that was always listening. Just last month, the stagecoach had been attacked. 3 men killed. The month before that, the Johnson homestead, 20 miles north, had been burned to the ground. The Apache. The word was spoken with fear and with hatred. They were savages, ghosts who struck and vanished, leaving only fire and blood. The United States Army was meant to stop it. Lieutenant Evans and his troop of cavalry rode through Providence often. Evans was a man carved from cold stone. He had a sharp jaw and eyes that saw everything as either an asset or an obstacle. He had spoken to Clara twice at the general store, his politeness a thin veneer over an unnerving arrogance. He looked at her as if she were a piece of property he was considering acquiring. He represented law, but it was a hard, unyielding law that sought to pave over the desert, to erase the people who had lived there for 1,000 years, and to put women like Clara firmly in their place. He was, in his own way, as much a cage as her father's love. Clara often felt trapped between these two forces, the rigid, suffocating order of the town and the soldiers, and the terrifying, brutal chaos of the Apache. She was supposed to fear the chaos and embrace the order, but her heart was a traitor. Sometimes. She looked at the soldiers in their stiff blue uniforms, their faces red with sun and whiskey, and she felt a revulsion. They were loud, and they were blind. They saw nothing of the land's beauty. They only saw a thing to be conquered. She finished her work on the fence, her hands aching. She picked up the hammer and the bag of nails. "I am going inside now, Pa," she said. He nodded, the worry easing from his face now that she was obeying, even belatedly. "That is good. I will check the livestock." She went into the small, 2-room cabin. It was clean, meticulously so. Her mother's few possessions were treated like relics: a porcelain teacup, a silver-backed mirror, a worn Bible. Clara moved through the motions of preparing their supper. She sliced bacon and mixed cornmeal for bread. But her mind was far away. She was thinking of a story she had read, of a woman who had sailed on a great ship, who had seen cities of stone and green hills. She was so lost in this thought that she did not at first hear the horses. It was not the slow, tired plod of her father's mule. It was the fast, rhythmic drumming of many ponies. Her father's voice, when it came, was not a call. It was a raw shout. "Clara, inside! Bar the door!" She froze. The knife fell from her hand and clattered on the wooden floor. She ran to the door, her heart leaping into her throat. She saw her father running from the small barn, his old rifle in his hand. And then she saw them. They were not a rumor. They were not a whisper. They were real. They came over the shallow rise behind the farm, a wave of motion and dust. Apache. Perhaps a dozen of them. Maybe more. They were lean and dark, their bodies painted. They rode as if they were part of the horses, their black hair streaming. They made no sound, no war cry, just the thunder of the hooves. "Inside," her father roared again. He stopped, raised his rifle, and fired. The sound was flat and useless in the vast air. One of the riders peeled away from the group, a streak of raw power. He was heading straight for her father. Clara screamed, "Pa, run!" But Jedediah was fumbling, trying to reload. He was brave, but he was slow. The warrior was upon him in seconds. Clara saw the blur of a raised arm, the glint of something. Her father fell. He did not move. It all happened in the space of 3 heartbeats. The world dissolved. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, her mind empty of everything but the image of her father lying in the dust. The riders swept past the cabin, heading for the town. Shouts were rising now, the sound of gunfire, the high, terrifying scream of a woman. Fire blossomed from the roof of the blacksmith shop. The attack had begun. Clara stumbled out onto the porch. She did not run for cover. She ran for her father. She fell to her knees beside him. "Pa," she whispered. She touched his chest. His shirt was dark, soaked with a wetness she did not need to see to understand. His eyes were open, staring at the hard, bright sky. He was gone. A shadow fell over her. She looked up, her vision blurred with a grief so sudden it was like a physical blow. A warrior sat on his pony. Looking down at her, he was different from the others. He was larger, his presence a weight. He was not painted for war, but he wore a simple leather band across his forehead. His face was stark, carved, his eyes as black and deep as the night sky. He seemed to carry the silence of the desert with him. Clara looked at him, her heart dead. There was no fear left. There was only a vast, empty cold. He watched her for a long moment. His gaze was not hot like Lieutenant Evans's. It was cold, analytical, like a hawk's. He was assessing her. She heard a man shout her name from the town, a sound of panic. "Clara, get to cover!" The warrior's head turned toward the sound. Then he looked back at her. He made a low sound in his throat. A command. He leaned down, and before Clara could react, his arms shot out. He grabbed the front of her dress, his grip like a steel trap. He did not lift her gently. He hauled her from the ground, a sack of grain, and threw her across the front of his pony. The air was knocked from her lungs. She landed hard, her face pressed against the horse's warm, sweating neck. The world spun. She felt the horse leap into a gallop. She was not killed. She was not left behind. She was being taken as the horse thundered away from the farm, away from the burning town, away from the body of her father. Clara Whitmore's world of suffocating order and quiet yearning ended. She was plunged into the very chaos she had been taught to fear her entire life. She was a captive, a piece of plunder in a war she did not understand. The man who held her, his arm clamped around her waist like an iron band, was a shadow, a legend, a savage. His name, she would learn, was Taza, and he was not a legend. He was a man. But in that moment, as the smoke from her burning life faded behind her, she knew nothing. She only knew that the cage was broken, and she had been thrown into the teeth of the wilderness. The morning broke like a fever, hot and sudden. Clara Whitmore was outside before the sun had fully cleared the eastern mesas, the air already holding a thick, baked quality. She was reinforcing a loose rail on the small corral, her movements efficient and angry. The hammer blows were sharp, punctuating the silence. "That is a man's work, Clara." Her father's voice, though quiet, made her strike the nailhead off center. The iron squealed against the wood. She did not turn. "It is a rail that is broken. Pa, the mule does not care who fixes it." Jedediah stepped off the cabin porch, his boots kicking up small puffs of pale dust. He was a good man, his face a map of worry and dry seasons. "I told you I would tend to it after the watering. It is not right. People in town talk. They say you are too forward." "Let them talk," Clara said, pulling another nail from the leather pouch at her waist. "Talk does not keep the mule from wandering into the sage. It is not about the mule, and you know it. He came to stand beside her, his shadow stretching long in the new light. You are 19 years old. A woman. Your mother. God rest her. She understood her place. She built a home. I want you safe. I want you settled. I am safe, she said, her voice tight. And I am settled. This is our home. It is not what I mean. He sighed. The sound of an old, tired argument. Mr. Henderson asked after you again. Clara stood up straight, the hammer heavy in her hand. She looked at her father, her love for him warring with the claustrophobia that his words always brought. Mr. Henderson was a man of 40 years, a widower with 3 loud children and a belly that strained his waistcoat. The thought of being his wife, of being penned inside that dark store, made her skin crawl. I do not wish to speak of Mr. Henderson. He is a good man. He is steady. He could give you a life. He could give me a cage, she said, the words sharper than she intended. Jedediah recoiled, his face hardening. That is a wicked thing to say. A cage. Is that what your mother had? Is that what I have given you? No, Pa, but I am not. She stopped. A sound had cut through her words. It was not the wind, which whispered, or the hawks, which screamed. It was a low, rhythmic vibration, a sound felt in the chest as much as heard with the ears. It was the sound of many horses, moving fast. Jedediah's head snapped up. His farmer's worry was gone, replaced by a stark, frontier terror. What is that? Clara looked past him, toward the low rise that separated their small farm from the open desert. The dust was first, a pale brown cloud, rising against the sharp blue of the sky. Then they appeared, cresting the rise. They were not soldiers. They were not prospectors. Apache, Jedediah breathed. The word was a prayer and a curse. Clara, inside the cabin. Now, bar the door. But she was frozen. It was not a dozen riders. It was 2 dozen, maybe more. A wave of dark skin and painted ponies, moving with a fluid, terrible silence. They were not whooping or yelling. They were simply coming. Go! Her father roared. He shoved her, breaking her paralysis. He ran for the cabin, scrambling inside. Clara stumbled after him, her heart a cold stone in her throat. She heard him slam the bar across the door, the heavy thud of the wood. He grabbed his old rifle from the wall pegs. Get down, he ordered, moving to the small window. Get below the window. Clara crouched, her back against the rough pine wall. She could hear the thunder of the hooves now, a sound that shook the very floorboards. It was joined by other sounds, a gunshot from the town, then another, then a volley, then screaming. The attack was not just on them. It was on all of Providence. They are firing the town, Jedediah whispered, his eye pressed to a crack in the wall. Sweet Jesus, they are everywhere. They are at the blacksmith's. Fire. The roof is on fire. Clara could smell it now, the acrid scent of burning pitch and dry wood, carried on the morning air. The hoofbeats were closer. They were right outside. They swept past the cabin, a storm of motion. They are going for the town, Jedediah said, a note of strained hope in his voice. Maybe they will pass us by. The words were barely out of his mouth when a single, powerful thud struck the cabin door. It was not a gunshot. It was a body. Someone had thrown himself against the door. Then again, a splintering sound. Jedediah raised his rifle, his hands shaking. Stay back, Clara. A third blow, and the bar splintered. The door flew open, torn from its leather hinges, and a man stood framed in the bright, terrible light. He was tall, broader than the others she had seen in the fleeting glimpse. His face was stark, his black hair held back by a simple leather band. His eyes were flat, deep, and held a cold intelligence. He held a rifle in one hand and a knife in the other. He looked at Jedediah. He looked at Clara. Jedediah fired. He was too slow, too terrified. The shot went wide, blasting a hole in the ceiling, showering them with sod and dust. The warrior moved. He was not fast, he was instant. He lunged forward, not at Jedediah, but past him. He grabbed Clara by the arm, his fingers digging into her skin like talons. He yanked her from her feet. "No!" she screamed. "Get your hands off her!" Jedediah yelled. He dropped the useless rifle and lunged, grabbing the warrior's shoulder. It was a fatal mistake. The warrior did not even look at him. With a single, fluid motion, he drove the knife backward and upward. Clara heard her father make a sound, a short, wet gasp, like a man punched in the stomach. The warrior released her arm and shoved her. She fell to the floor, scrambling on the packed earth. Jedediah stood for a second, his eyes wide with a terrible surprise. He looked down at the knife hilt protruding from his chest. He looked at Clara. "Run!" he whispered. Then he crumpled, falling forward. Clara screamed. It was a sound without thought, a raw denial. She scrambled toward her father, toward the fallen man. But the warrior was faster. He grabbed her again, this time by the braid of her hair, and hauled her backward. The pain was blinding. He dragged her out of the cabin, into the sunlight that was now thick with smoke. "No!" she shrieked, clawing at his hand. "Let me go, Pa!" He ignored her. His pony was waiting. Its reins looped, trained to stand. In one motion, he threw her face down across the pony's withers, then swung up behind her. An arm, like an iron bar, clamped around her waist, pinning her. He dug his heels into the pony's sides, and the world exploded into a jarring, violent gallop. Clara fought. She was not the fainting type. She was not a damsel. She was a farm girl. And she was strong. And she was filled with a grief that had turned instantly to rage. She bucked and kicked, trying to unseat him. She twisted, her hands clawing at his arm, her nails seeking skin. "Let me go!" she screamed, her voice hoarse. "You murderer! Let me go!" She felt her nails connect, digging deep into his forearm. She drew blood. His response was nothing. He did not flinch. He did not grunt. He did not tighten his grip. He simply absorbed her fury as if she were a child swatting at a mountain. His total, inhuman indifference was more terrifying than a blow. He wheeled the horse, and she was forced to see the town. It was chaos. Providence was burning. She saw men she knew, men who had tipped their hats to her, lying in the street. She saw Mrs. Henderson's general store, the place her father had wanted her to live, engulfed in yellow flames. She heard the gunfire, sporadic now, and the screams, which were not. She saw a flash of blue. Soldiers. A small troop of cavalry was riding hard from the fort, firing their carbines from a distance. They were too late. The Apache warriors were already pulling back. A coordinated retreat, vanishing back into the dust they had come from. Her captor urged his pony faster, joining the retreating wave. They rode hard, leaving the smoke and the death behind. Clara stopped fighting. Her strength was gone, her rage hollowed out by the image of her father falling. She hung limp, the jolting of the horse a relentless punishment. They rode for hours. They did not slow. The sun climbed, beating down on her back. Her face, pressed against the horse's sweating neck, was caked with dust and tears. The warrior behind her was a machine. He did not rest. He did not speak. He was just a hard, breathing presence. His arm locked around her. They left the flat desert and entered the canyons, a maze of red rock and shadow. The world Clara knew, the world of her farm and the single street of Providence, disappeared. This was the Apache's land. Every rock, every twisted juniper tree seemed to be an accomplice. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the canyon walls in shades of blood when they finally stopped. It was not a camp. It was a shallow overhang of rock, high on a cliff wall, a place invisible from below. The other warriors were there, dismounting, their ponies lathered and trembling. The man holding her, Taza, finally released his grip. He did not help her down. He simply let go, and she slid, stiff and agonizingly sore, to the rocky ground. She landed on her hands and knees, and for a moment she could not move. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. She looked up. The warriors were gathered, speaking in low, guttural tones. They were not celebrating, they were grim. Several were wounded, their skins slick with blood. One man was being laid on the ground, an arrow protruding from his shoulder. This had not been a simple raid. It had been a battle, and they had paid a price. She saw him, Taza. He was standing apart, his back to her, speaking to two of the warriors. He was the leader. It was obvious in his bearing, in the way they listened. His voice was low, a rumble of authority. He was a legend. Clara had heard the name spoken in whispers at the fort, spat with hatred in the saloon. Taza, the one they could not catch, the one who struck like a ghost and left only fire. They said he was not a man, but a devil. Now, he turned. He looked at her. His eyes, even in the growing twilight, were sharp, missing nothing. He saw her hatred, her fear, her exhaustion. He walked toward her. Clara scrambled backward, crab walking until her back hit the cold stone of the cliff. "Stay away from me," she hissed, her voice a dry rasp. He did not stop. He loomed over her, a tall silhouette against the dying light. He untied a leather pouch from his belt and tossed something at her. It landed in her lap. It was a piece of dark, dried meat. "Eat," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel. It was the first word he had spoken to her. She snatched the meat and threw it back at him, striking him in the chest. "Murderer!" she spat. "You killed my father!" He did not move. He simply looked at her, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The other warriors had stopped, watching. Taza bent slowly, picked up the piece of meat, and grabbed her wrist. His grip was not cruel. It was absolute. He forced her hand open and pressed the meat back into her palm, closing her fingers around it. "Eat," he said again. It was not a request. She opened her mouth to refuse, to scream at him again, but her defiance died. She looked at the faces of the other warriors, their eyes hard and filled with contempt. She looked at Taza, at the blood she had drawn still drying on his forearm. She understood nothing. Why was she here? Why was she alive? They had killed everyone else, her father, her neighbors. Why her? She was not a warrior. She was not valuable. Taza turned away from her, satisfied. He went to tend to his horse, his movements economical and precise. Clara was left alone, tied by her wrists to a scrubby bush. The cold of the high desert night began to creep in, seeping through her thin dress. She was shivering, but it was not just from the cold, it was from the shock, the grief, and the terrifying, unspoken realization. She had been kept alive for a reason. This man, this savage, this legend, had a purpose for her. She was a hostage, a pawn in a game she could not comprehend. Her old life, the one of clear rules and suffocating safety, was gone, burned to ash with the town of Providence. Her new life had begun, here in the rocks, a captive of the man who had murdered her father. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the wind, that her survival would depend on understanding him. They traveled for 2 more days, moving deeper into the serrated heart of the mountains. Clara rode until her mind was numb, a passenger in her own life. The world was reduced to the sharp smell of her captor's horse, the relentless jolting, and the iron-hard arm that encircled her waist. Taza spoke only to his men, and then only in low, clipped commands that she could not understand. He did not speak to her at all. He did not look at her. She was a piece of luggage, a thing he was transporting. They finally arrived at the Apache camp, the rancheria, late in the afternoon of the 3rd day. It was not a collection of teepees. as she had seen in drawings. It was a cluster of wickiups, domed shelters made of brush and hides, nestled in a high canyon that was nearly invisible from any approach. Smoke rose in thin, blue columns, and the air smelled of roasting meat and wood smoke. When they rode in, the camp came alive, but it was not with celebration. Women and children emerged, their faces hard and searching. They looked at the warriors, counting. They looked at the wounded. Their expressions were grim. Then they saw Clara. The looks she received were not simple curiosity. They were a raw, open hatred that struck her like a physical blow. The women, their faces lined with sun and grief, stared at her with such contempt that Clara flinched, pulling in on herself. A small boy, no older than 5 years, picked up a stone and threw it, striking her in the leg. He shouted something, and the women near him laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Taza brought his pony to a halt in the center of the camp. He dismounted in one fluid motion, then reached up and pulled Clara from the horse. He did not catch her. He simply let her drop. She fell to her knees in the dust, her dress torn, her hair a tangled mat. He turned his back on her and began speaking to an old woman who had approached. She was ancient, her face a web of deep lines, her black eyes holding a fierce, undimmed intelligence. She and Taza spoke, and though she was a woman, she did not defer to him. She argued, her voice sharp. Taza's voice remained low, but it had a cutting edge. He gestured, not at Clara, but toward the east, the direction of Providence. The old woman shook her head, her anger clear. Clara stayed on her knees, watching. This was Taza. The men she had overheard in the saloon called him a devil, a butcher. Here, he was a leader, but one who was being questioned. He was the pride of his tribe, a man whose strength was a legend. But he had returned from his raid with wounded men and a white captive. It was clear not all approved. Taza's arm still bore the dark, dried blood from where Clara had scratched him. But she noticed something else. As he turned, his shirt, sticky with sweat and grime, pulled tight against his side, there was a dark, wet stain on the buckskin, just above his hip. He had been wounded. The bullet graze or knife cut from the battle was worse than she had thought. He moved with a stiff, controlled grace, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. He was in pain. The argument ended. Taza gave a sharp command to one of the other warriors, who roughly pulled Clara to her feet. He tied her hands, not tightly, but securely, and then shoved her toward one of the wickiups. She was a prisoner. The days that followed were a blur of misery and confusion. She was given the lowest tasks. She hauled water from a spring a quarter-mile distant, her shoulders screaming from the weight of the clay jugs. She scraped hides, a nauseating job that left her hands raw and her stomach churning. She was given scraps to eat, barely enough to keep her going. The women watched her constantly, their hatred a palpable thing. They spoke to her only in commands, and when she did not understand, they slapped her. But it was Taza who held her true attention. She watched him. She could not help it. He was a constant, powerful presence. He was not a chief in the way she had imagined, sitting in idleness. He was working constantly. He spoke with the hunters. He inspected the horses. He sat with the wounded, his face grim. His reputation for brutality in battle was, she suspected, earned. But here, in his own camp, he was the center, the man holding his world together through sheer force of will. And he was getting worse. The wound in his side was not healing. The desert heat was a terrible enemy. She saw him, late one afternoon, stumble as he walked from the horse herd. He caught himself on a wickiup pole, his body rigid. No one said anything, but they all saw. A man who had been a living legend of strength was now leaning, his breath coming in short, harsh pants. The old woman who had argued with him saw it too. She was called Ayala. She watched him, Her black eyes narrowed. Then, her gaze shifted. She looked across the camp, directly at Clara, who was trying to grind corn on a flat stone, her movements clumsy and inefficient. Iala marched over to her. She barked a command. Clara looked up, uncomprehending. Iala grabbed her by the arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and hauled her to her feet. She dragged Clara across the camp to where Taza sat, his back against a rock, his face pale beneath his dark skin. He was sweating, though the sun was beginning to set. He looked up as they approached, his eyes filmed with fever. Iala shoved Clara forward, making her stumble. She then pushed a shallow bowl into Clara's hands. It held murky water and a wad of crushed leaves, some kind of potent herb. Iala pointed at Taza's side. Then she pointed at Clara. The command was unmistakable. Clean him. Clara recoiled, dropping the bowl. The water splashed onto the hot dust. "No," she whispered. "I will not." Iala's hand flashed out, a hard, open-palmed strike that cracked across Clara's face and sent her sprawling. The camp went silent. "You will," Iala said. Her English was broken, but her meaning was perfectly clear. She refilled the bowl from a water skin, added more leaves, and thrust it back at Clara. "He brought you. You will work, or you will die." Taza said nothing. He just watched, his breathing labored. His eyes were not cruel. They were simply waiting, detached, as if he were watching a hawk decide which rabbit to take. Trembling, with a rage that was almost as potent as her fear, Clara picked up the bowl. She looked at the man who had murdered her father, the man who had stolen her life, and she knelt in the dust in front of him. Iala said something, and Taza untied the leather thong that held his shirt. With a wince, he pulled the buckskin garment over his head. Clara's breath caught. She had never seen a man's bare chest, not her father's, not anyone's. She had expected a savage, but this was just a man. His skin was a dark, polished copper, slick with sweat. His shoulders were broad, his chest and stomach defined by hard, lean muscle. The body of a man who lived a life of relentless physical demand. Old scars, white and silver, crisscrossed his skin, and then there was the wound. It was a long, ugly gash on his right side, just over his ribs. It was puckered, inflamed, and weeping. It was badly infected. "Clean it," Iala ordered, standing over her. Clara's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the cloth Iala gave her. She dipped it in the water, her stomach rolling. The smell of him filled her senses. It was not just the sickness. It was sweat and leather and dust and something else, something fundamentally male. It was terrifying. She touched the cloth to his skin, far from the wound. He did not flinch, but she felt the heat radiating from him. He was burning with fever. "Do it," Iala hissed. Clara took a shaky breath. She closed her eyes for a moment. Seeing her father's face, "I cannot," but she could. She had to. She pressed the cloth to the edge of the wound. Taza's entire body went rigid. A low sound, not a groan, but a sharp intake of breath, escaped him. His jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscles knot. But he did not move. He did not push her away. He sat like a statue of stone, enduring. Her fear began to war with something else, a strange, unwelcome pity. He was her enemy. He was a murderer, but he was also in agony, and his pride was such that he would die before he showed it. She found a grim, cold corner in her mind and focused. She began to clean the wound, her movements becoming less timid, more practical. This was a wound, like she had seen on farm animals, on her father's hands. It needed to be cleaned of the poison. She worked in silence, the only sounds the harsh rasp of Taza's breathing and the distant sounds of the camp. She was intensely, painfully aware of him, aware of the texture of his skin, the hard wall of his abdomen under her hand, The way his black hair, damp with sweat, clung to his neck. She was closer to him than she had ever been to any living soul, save her parents. Her hand, clumsy with nerves, slipped. The heel of her palm brushed against his bare stomach, a place of soft skin just below the hard muscle. She gasped and snatched her hand back as if she had been burned. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she felt dizzy. She stared at her own hand, trembling. She whispered, the words coming out before she could stop them. She was not speaking to him. She was speaking to the rock, to the air, to the ghost of her old life. I have never been this close to a man. The words hung in the hot, still air. It was a confession of her innocence, of her terror, of the profound, shattering intimacy of this moment. She kept her head down, her hair falling forward to hide her burning face, expecting him to laugh or to say nothing at all. For a long moment, he was silent. Then his voice came. It was not the strong command she had heard him use. It was a low, rough whisper, so quiet she barely heard it, a sound torn from his fever-dry throat. You already are. Her head snapped up. She looked at him. His eyes were open, no longer hazed, but sharp and lucid, burning into hers. His words were not a comfort. They were not a threat. They were a simple, brutal statement of fact. You are here. This is your reality. You are my captive. The gulf between her old life and this moment was complete. She was his. Clara said nothing. She could not speak. The connection between them in that instant was as real and as sharp as the knife he carried. It was not born of affection. It was forged in violence, in grief, and in this terrible, forced intimacy. She hated him. She hated him with all her soul. But as she looked into his fever-bright eyes, she realized, with a chilling dread, that she no longer saw a monster. She saw a man, and that was far, far more dangerous. She broke his gaze. With shaking hands, she dipped the cloth back into the bowl and returned to her work. She finished in silence, her every nerve alight, her world reduced to the scent of this man's skin and the terrible weight of his words. Her act was done. Clara pulled her hand back, the damp cloth clutched in her fist. The silence in the small circle of firelight was absolute. There was only the sound of Taza's labored breathing and the skitter of a lizard on the rocks nearby. She kept her head bowed, her hair a curtain hiding her burning face. His words, "You already are," echoed in her mind. They were not an invitation. They were a judgment, a statement of an unalterable fact. She was his captive, and he had just forced her to acknowledge a boundary she had never even known existed. Ayala grunted, a sound of grim satisfaction. She pushed another, smaller bowl at Clara. This one contained a thick, dark paste that smelled of pine sap and something bitter. Ayala pointed at the wound. Clara understood. She had to dress it. Her hands, still shaking, felt clumsy. She scooped up the poultice. It was sticky and warm. She looked at Taza. He had not moved. His black eyes were still fixed on her, his expression unreadable, though the muscles in his jaw were knotted tight. He was enduring this, enduring her. She applied the paste, her fingers, stained with grime and now this herbal mixture, moved over his skin. She had to cover the long, inflamed gash. He hissed, a sharp, involuntary sound, as the paste touched the raw flesh, but he did not pull away. He held himself rigid, a monument of controlled pain. Clara finished the task, her heart hammering a sick rhythm against her ribs. Ayala handed her a strip of clean, tanned deer hide, surprisingly soft. Clara wrapped it around his torso, her arms having to reach around him. She was forced to lean in, her face just inches from his bare shoulder. He smelled of fever and dust and the sharp, clean scent of the pine paste. She tied the bandage, her knuckles brushing his skin one last time. Then she scrambled back, putting distance between them. She felt sullied, shaken to her very core. She had touched the man who had murdered her father, tended his wound, felt the heat of his skin. For the next 3 days, that was her life. Taza's fever worsened before it broke. He was moved inside his wickiup, a space barely large enough for 2 people, and Iala made it clear that Clara was responsible for him. The hatred from the other women was a constant, biting wind, but Iala's authority was absolute. Clara was the white captive. She was Taza's. Her fate was tied to his. She sat in the dim, smoky confines of the brush shelter, listening to him breathe. He drifted in and out of consciousness. He would murmur in his own language, the words rough and guttural. Sometimes they sounded like commands. Sometimes they sounded like pain. She would fetch him water in a small cup, lifting his heavy head to help him drink. He was weaker than she could have imagined. This legend, this butcher of Providence, was now a man helpless at her hands. A dark, twisted part of her wished for the fever to do its work. If he died, she thought, it would be justice. It would be an end. But what end? What would happen to her then? Would the women, their faces hard with grief from the raid, finally be allowed to kill her? This thought terrified her. She was trapped. Her survival, she realized, now depended entirely on the survival of her captor. So she worked. She bathed his face with cool water. She forced sips of a bitter herbal tea between his cracked lips. She watched the bandage for any sign of the infection worsening. Her hatred for him was a cold, solid thing in her chest, but her hands, moving with a practiced competence she had learned on the farm, betrayed her. They fought for his life, even as her mind recoiled from him. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. She was dozing, her head against the wickiup wall, when his movement startled her awake. He was sitting up, the deer-hide bandage stark against his dark skin. He was soaked in sweat, but his eyes were clear. The fever was gone. He was just watching her. Clara froze, her heart leaping. The silence stretched. His gaze was not hot, it was cold, assessing. He was looking at her as if she were a puzzle he had not yet solved. "You did not kill me," he said. His voice was a dry rasp. "I was ordered not to," she retorted, her voice sharp with fear and a sudden jolt of her old defiance. A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, touched the corner of his mouth, but it was gone instantly. "You are not a good liar." He swung his legs over the side of the low bed, his body tight with the pain of the movement, but he did not grunt. He stood, a little unsteady, but on his feet. The crisis was over. He was still Taza. He was still her enemy. But something had irrevocably shifted between them. He was no longer just a brute. He was a man whose life she had held in her hands. And he knew it. As he recovered, Clara was returned to her menial tasks. But her world had changed. Her perception had been cracked open. She was no longer just a terrified prisoner, blind to her surroundings. She was an observer. She watched the Apache. The people of Providence had called them savages, animals. But what she saw was not chaos. It was a different kind of society, a hard and demanding one, shaped by the land itself. She saw the women, who worked from sunup to sundown, their hands as tough as leather, their backs strong. They were the center of the camp. They built the homes. They prepared the food. They processed every part of the animals the hunters brought in. They were hard on her, yes, but they were hard on everyone, and she saw them laugh, low, throaty laughs as they worked. She saw a mother stroke her child's hair with a tenderness that made Clara's throat ache. She saw the men. They were not the loud, boasting men of the Providence saloon. They were quiet. They moved with a silent, cat-like grace. They spent hours caring for their horses, speaking to them in low murmurs. They treated their weapons with a similar reverence. They were hunters and warriors, and their life was a constant, desperate fight for survival. She learned their values not from words, but from actions. They valued endurance. They valued community. No one ate until everyone ate, even if the meal was just a handful of roasted nuts. They valued courage, but they did not seem to value recklessness. The raid on Providence, she began to realize, had not been a random act of savagery. It had been a desperate, targeted attack. She had heard Ayala arguing with Taza, her voice sharp with grief, pointing to the wounded. The raid had cost them. They were not monsters. They were people at war, fighting for their homes, for their very lives, against the soldiers and the settlers who were pushing them into smaller and smaller corners of the desert. Taza himself remained a distant, powerful figure. He did not speak to her. He did not thank her for her care. But he no longer ignored her. He watched her. His suspicion was a palpable thing. He would see her gaze drift eastward, toward the mountains that hid her old life, and his face would harden. One afternoon, as she was hauling a heavy skin of water from the spring, she stumbled. The skin was heavy, and her hands were raw and blistered. She saw Taza watching her from across the camp. He was speaking with another warrior, his newly healed side still bound. He saw her fall to one knee, the water skin threatening to pull her over. He stopped speaking. He walked toward her. Clara tensed, expecting a blow, a reprimand for her clumsiness. He stopped in front of her. He did not offer a hand. He did not speak. He simply reached down and took the heavy water skin from her shoulder. His fingers brushed her arm, a brief, calloused touch that sent a jolt through her. He lifted the skin as if it weighed nothing and carried it to his wickiup. He dropped it by the entrance and then turned and walked away, resuming his conversation as if nothing had happened. Clara stayed on her knee for a long moment, staring at the dust. Her mind was reeling. A brute would have kicked her. A savage would have laughed. A man might do what he had just done. It was not kindness. It was a practical, impatient gesture. Or perhaps it was an acknowledgement, a payment of a sort, for the life she had given back to him. This small act of confused humanity shattered her defenses more than any cruelty could have. Her internal war began. She would be scraping a hide, the sun beating on her back, and the image of her father's face, his eyes wide with surprise as he fell, would rise in her mind. The grief would be so sharp, so suffocating, that she would have to stop, her hand frozen. And then her mind would superimpose another image, Taza, his face pale with fever, his black eyes fixed on hers, vulnerable. She loved her father. She hated Taza. This was the truth. This was the rock she had to cling to. But her heart was a traitor. She remembered the feel of his skin, the hard muscle of his ribs, the way his arm had felt around her on the horse. It was not a romantic memory. It was a physical fact, a brand on her senses. She would find herself watching him as he moved through the camp, his body now strong and fluid again. She watched the way he walked, the way he carried himself, the undeniable power in his lean frame, and she would feel a flush rise from her chest to her throat, a feeling so unwanted, so deeply shameful. It made her feel sick. How could she? How could she feel this terrible pull toward the man who had destroyed her world? It was a betrayal. It was a sin against her father's memory. She began to see her old life with new, painful clarity. She thought of Providence. She thought of the small, stuffy rooms, the judgment of the townswomen, the endless, repetitive tasks. She thought of her father's love, which had been a cage, a demand that she be small and silent and safe. She thought of Mr. Henderson's wet, smiling mouth. Here, she was a captive. She was a slave, but she had never seen women like Ayala in Providence. Women who spoke their minds to the strongest warrior. Women who owned their own homes, whose opinions held weight. Here, the rules were brutal, but they were simple. Survive, endure, protect the family. She realized with a jolt that she could not go back, even if she escaped, even if she found her way back to what was left of the town. She could never be that girl again. She could never fit into that small, restrictive dress. could never again nod politely and hold her tongue. The girl who had wanted to marry for safety was gone, burned away with the farm. But she could not stay here. She was the white woman, the enemy. She was a ghost among these people, a reminder of the war that was pressing in on them. She was trapped by the Apache, trapped by the soldiers who would, she was sure, eventually come, and trapped, most terribly of all, by her own heart, which was at war with her mind. She was a woman caught between two worlds, belonging to neither, and her only anchor in this terrifying new life was the man she was supposed to hate most of all. Weeks bled into a month. The raw wound of her father's death did not heal, but it scarred over, a hard, protective layer of numbness. Clara's life found a rhythm, albeit a brutal one. It was a life of stone and thirst, of wood smoke and the smell of hides. She learned to anticipate the needs of the camp, to haul the water before Iala had to shout, to grind the corn with a steady, circular motion that no longer left her hands raw, but built calluses over her blisters. Her hatred for Taza remained, a cold stone in her gut. It was the only piece of her old life she had left, but it was no longer simple. It had become complicated, tangled with other, more treacherous feelings. She watched him. She could not stop watching him. Now that his strength had returned, he was the axis around underscore which the entire camp turned. She saw now what she had been blind to in her first weeks of grief. He was not just a warrior. He was the Yin, the leader. His word was not law, but it held immense weight. She saw him sit for hours with the elders, his face carved from stone, listening. He was not a tyrant. He was a man shouldering an impossible burden. One evening, the meager supplies from the raid on Providence were brought to the center fire for distribution. Clara watched from the shadows, her assigned task of mending a buckskin shirt in her lap. She saw the flour, her flour, from Mr. Henderson's store. She saw the salted bacon, the bags of coffee, the ammunition. It was so little. For this, her town had burned. For this, her father had died. A woman, whose son had been one of the wounded, began to wail, pointing to the small pile of food and then to her children. It was not enough. Taza stood, his face impassive. He spoke, his voice low and carrying. The woman fell silent, but her hatred, directed at him, was a palpable thing. He had led the raid. He was responsible. Then Iala stepped forward. She portioned out the food, her movements precise. She gave Taza his share, the same as any other warrior. Clara watched as Taza took his portion of cornmeal and dried meat, walked to where an old man sat coughing by a cold fire, and set the food down in front of him. He did it without ceremony, without a word, and then walked away into the darkness to check the horses. Clara's needle stopped. She stared at the place where he had stood. He had killed her father for this food, and he had just given his own share away to someone weaker. The simplicity of the act, the stark illustration of his responsibility, shook her. He was not a monster driven by bloodlust. He was a leader, bound by a duty she could barely comprehend, making choices that were costing him everything. He was fighting for the survival of these people, and he was failing. That, she realized, was the source of the shadows in his eyes. He was not just a warrior. He was a shepherd of a dying flock. Her new understanding of him made her own position even more dangerous. She saw the way the other warriors looked at her. Dakota, the man whose brother had been shot by the soldiers in the raid, watched her with a raw, undisguised malice. He saw her as a bad omen, a white mouth to feed, a symbol of the people who were hunting them. One morning, she went to the spring. It was further than usual. As the nearer one had run dry, she was alone, a risk Iala had deemed necessary. As she was filling the heavy clay jugs, Dakota appeared. He stepped from the rock so silently she did not know he was there until his shadow fell over her. She scrambled to her feet, her heart leaping into her throat. "I'm just getting water," she said, her voice trembling. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, his face a mask of contempt. He took a step closer. "White woman," he said, the English words thick with his accent. "You are Taza's woman." "No," she said, recoiling. "I am his captive." "He keeps you," Dakota said, taking another step. "He feeds you. He did not kill you. He brought this curse here." He pointed back toward the camp. "He is weak because of you." "That is not true," she whispered, her back pressing against the cold rock of the canyon wall. Dakota's hand shot out and he grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like talons. "My brother is dead, and you are here. This is not justice." He raised his other hand, and Clara flinched, closing her eyes, bracing for the blow. It never came. "Dakota." Taza's voice. It was not loud. It was soft, and as cold as the spring water. He was standing 10 feet away, his arms loose at his sides, his eyes fixed on the hand Dakota had on Clara's arm. He had moved with no sound. Dakota froze. He did not release her, but his body went rigid. The two men locked gazes. A silent, brutal war was fought in that stare. Dakota was challenging his leader. Taza was asserting his will. The air crackled with the tension. Slowly, his face twisting with hatred. Dakota released her. He shoved her back, making her stumble, but his gaze never left Taza. He spat on the ground near Clara's feet, then turned and stalked away. Clara was shaking so hard she could not stand. She slid down the rock face, her knees buckling. Taza did not move. He just watched her, his expression as hard and unforgiving as the landscape. He was going to," she stammered. "You will not leave the camp alone again," Taza said. It was not a comfort. It was a command. She looked up at him, her anger, born of terror, suddenly flashing. "Leave the camp. I am your prisoner. You. She wanted to scream at him, to accuse him of all of it, of her father, of Dakota, of her ruined life. "You are my responsibility," he said, cutting her off. His eyes were dark. "A responsibility I did not ask for, but you are mine. What is mine? No other man touches." He turned and walked away, leaving her to retrieve the water jugs with hands that would not stop shaking. She carried the water back, his words echoing. "You are mine." It was not a declaration of affection. It was a brand. It was the only thing keeping her alive. She was his property, his burden. She hated him for it. But as she remembered the look in Dakota's eyes, a cold dread filled her. She hated him, and she needed him to live. This tangled, poisonous dependence was a new kind of cage. She began to feel that her affection, her unwilling care for him when he was sick, was a profound betrayal. It was a weakness in her that he could see, and it was a danger to them both. The tension between them grew. It was no longer the simple dynamic of captive and captor. It was a heavy, unspoken awareness. When he was in the camp, she knew it. She could feel his presence, a weight in the air. He, in turn, watched her. His suspicion was still there, but it was mixed with something else, a watchfulness, a curiosity. He was a man who had never had to consider the world of a white woman, and now one was living in his shadow. The hot, dry weeks of late summer gave way to a sudden, violent autumn. A storm blew in from the north, a freezing, brutal rain that turned the canyon to a river of mud. The temperature plummeted. Clara, whose only shelter was a leaky lean-to she shared with 2 other women who despised her, was soaked in minutes. Her thin cotton dress offered no protection. She huddled behind a boulder, her body racked with shivers so violent her teeth clicked together. She was going to die. The thought was calm, almost a relief. She would freeze to death, and it would be over. She closed her eyes, the icy water plastering her hair to her face. The flap of a wickiup was thrown open. "Taza's," He stood silhouetted against the dim warmth within, looking out at the storm. His gaze found her, a small, shivering bundle in the deluge. He did not call to her. He did not move toward her. He simply stood, a dark shape, and watched her. Clara stared back, unable to move. This was it. He would watch her freeze. It was a fitting end. Then he jerked his head once, a simple, impatient gesture. Inside. She could not believe it. She waited, thinking she was wrong. He jerked his head again, more sharply, stiffly, her limbs numb. Clara forced herself to her feet. She stumbled through the mud, her feet sliding. She reached his wickiup and paused at the entrance, water cascading off her. She looked up at him. His face was a mask of shadows. He stepped back, allowing her room to enter. She crawled inside. The small shelter was dark, but it was dry, and the air was thick with the scent of smoke and warm hides. A tiny fire smoldered in a center pit, giving off more heat than light. He came in after her, dropping the heavy hide flap, plunging them into a deep, intimate gloom. "Sit," he commanded, his voice low. He gestured to the far side of the wickiup. A pile of dry furs lay there. He went to his own side, near the entrance, and sat with his back to her, wrapping a thick blanket around his shoulders. He was deliberately, pointedly, giving her distance. Clara moved to the furs, her body shaking too hard to control. She sat and pulled a dry, heavy buffalo hide over her. It was heavy and smelled of him, of dust and leather and something uniquely male. The warmth slowly began to seep into her, a painful, tingling sensation. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the storm lashing the outside of the wickiup and the sound of their own breathing. She was in his home. He was meters away. The murderer of her father, the man who had saved her from Dakota, the man who had just brought her in from the storm. The contradictions were a physical pain. "Why?" she finally whispered, her voice a raw croak. He did not turn. His back remained a rigid wall. "The storm is cold." "You could have left me," she said. "A dead captive cannot be traded," he said, his voice flat. Clara absorbed the cold. Practical words. He was right, of course. She was a bargaining chip. He was protecting his investment. But the words felt like a lie, or at least, not the entire truth. He had not needed to save her. He could have claimed the storm took her. It would have solved his Dakota problem. She pulled the fur tighter. "Thank you," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. He said nothing. They sat for hours as the storm raged. The darkness was suffocating. She was so aware of him, of his presence in the small space, that it was hard to breathe. This man was her entire world. He was her jailer and her protector. She realized, with a sickening lurch, that she could not leave him, not just because she was a prisoner, but because her life was now so inextricably bound to his. She no longer knew who she was without him. Her hatred was real, but this new, terrifying dependence was just as strong. The war would not let them be. 2 days later, a scout, the same one from before, rode into camp, his pony nearly dead from exhaustion. He fell from the horse and spoke to Taza, his voice choked with panic. Clara, who was scraping a hide near Iala, saw Taza's body go rigid. He issued a series of sharp commands. The camp exploded, but it was not chaos. It was a terrifying, silent efficiency. In 5 minutes, the wickiups were being struck. The horses gathered, the children bundled. They were running. "Soldiers!" Iala spat, grabbing Clara's arm. "They come!" Taza was on his horse, his rifle in his hand. He wheeled the pony and pointed at Clara. "Put her up." Another warrior grabbed her, throwing her onto the back of a pack mule. The tribe was moving, flowing like water up a narrow canyon pass, disappearing into the rocks. They were masters of this, of vanishing. But the soldiers were closer than they had thought. Gunfire erupted from the mouth of the canyon below. A cavalry patrol. Their blue uniforms stark against the red rock had cut them off. "Go!" Taza roared. He and 3 other warriors turned, riding back toward the soldiers to buy the others time. Clara's mule was shoved forward with the women and children. They scrambled up a narrow goat path, but the soldiers were smart. They had sent a second group around. As Clara reached a high ledge, 5 soldiers appeared above them. Lieutenant Evans was at their head. His face was grim, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "Clara!" he shouted, his voice echoing, "Clara Whitmore, you are safe! Come to us!" The women around her scattered, trying to pull the children back. Clara was frozen on the mule, exposed. "Clara!" Evans called again, raising a hand. "We are here. We will not harm you. Come away from them." She was 50 yards from him, 50 yards from rescue, from her old life, from safety. She looked down the pass. She could see Taza, firing from behind a boulder, holding back the main force. He was fighting to save the people who were fleeing. He was fighting to save her. She looked at Evans, his clean-shaven face, his pressed blue uniform, his eyes that had always looked at her like a possession. He represented the world that had tried to put her in a cage. "Clara, that is an order. Come here." She looked at Taza. He was her captor, her enemy, the man who had brought her into this world of blood and fear. He was the man who had given his food to an elder, who had sheltered her from the storm. "He has her," one of the soldiers said, raising his rifle. "She is a prisoner. Fire on the warrior." "No!" Evans shouted. "Hold your fire!" He looked at Clara, his patience gone. "Clara, I will not ask again. Are you with us or with them?" It was the choice, her old world or this new one, the cage of safety or the brutal, terrifying freedom of the wild. Taza had looked up. He was watching her. She could see his face. He was too far to read his expression, but he was watching. He was waiting. Clara opened her mouth. She looked at Lieutenant Evans, at the flag his man carried, at the rifles pointed her way. Then she turned her head. She looked at the Apache women, their faces terrified, clutching their children. She said nothing. She grabbed the mule's rope and kicked its sides, urging it away from Evans, further up the path. After Iyala. "Clara!" Evans roared, his voice filled with disbelief and rage. "Stop her!" A gunshot cracked the air. But it was not from Evans. It was from Taza, who had seen the soldier aim. The soldier by Evans cried out and clutched his shoulder. In that moment of chaos, Clara disappeared over the rise. Following the Apache, she did not look back. She had made her choice. She had chosen the man she hated. She had chosen the people who saw her as their enemy. She had betrayed her own. And she had never felt so terribly, irrevocably alive. The bullet from Taza's rifle cracked the dry air. A flat, sharp sound. The soldier beside Lieutenant Evans cried out, not in pain but in surprise, and stumbled, his own rifle discharging harmlessly into the sky. In that single frozen moment of chaos, Clara kicked the mule's ribs. The animal, terrified, scrambled up the last few feet of the rocky incline and over the rise. She was not safe. She was just out of immediate sight. The air was filled with shouting, the screams of men and the thunder of repeating rifles. It was not a skirmish. It was a full-scale battle. She could hear the volley fire of the soldiers, a disciplined, rolling thunder that was horribly different from the sporadic, individual shots of the Apache. "Get down, girl!" Iyala's voice was a rasp in her ear. The old woman's hand, strong as a man's, grabbed Clara's arm and hauled her from the mule's back. Clara fell to the rock, the impact jarring her teeth. "Run as they run!" The Apache women and children were not panicking. They were moving with a desperate, practiced speed. a river of humanity flowing up a narrow, twisting game trail that was all but invisible. They carried their infants, they dragged their toddlers, they moved with the silence and certainty of mountain goats. Clara scrambled to her feet and ran with them. She looked back, just once. The ledge she had just left was a scene from hell. Lieutenant Evans and his small group were firing down into the canyon, but the real fight was below. Taza and his 3 warriors were not fighting a rearguard. They were fighting an army. It was not a patrol. It was a full company of cavalry, perhaps 60 men or more, their blue uniforms filling the canyon floor. They had been led here. They had known. Taza and his men were hopelessly, terribly outnumbered. They were using the rocks, firing, moving, trying to draw the soldiers' fire, to buy the women and children just these few precious seconds. Clara saw one of the warriors, a young man she had seen laughing just days before, slump from behind his rock, his rifle clattering. A spray of blue-coated soldiers swarmed him. She kept running, her lungs burning, her heart a cold, sick knot. She was running because Taza was down there, dying. He was dying to save her. The thought was a spike in her brain. He had fired at the soldier who had aimed at her. He had saved her life, seconds after she had chosen to betray her own people. She reached another bend in the trail. Higher now. She could see the main body of the battle. Taza's horse went down. Its scream high and thin, a sound of pure agony. Taza leapt clear, rolling. He came up on one knee, his rifle already at his shoulder. He fired. A soldier fell. But he did not get up. He tried, pushing himself, and then he stumbled. His left leg. He was hit. He fell to one knee again, his side dark. Not just his leg, his old wound, the one she had tended, had been torn open, or he had been shot there as well. He was bleeding heavily. He saw her, even from that distance. Their eyes met. He was on one knee, his rifle empty, the soldiers advancing. He saw her watching. He raised his arm, not in a wave, but in a furious command. He pointed up the trail. Go! Move, girl, Iala hissed, grabbing her again, shaking her from her trance. Do not waste his life. He buys us this time. Go! Iala turned and followed the last of the children, disappearing into a crack in the rock. Clara was alone on the path. She looked down at Taza. He was surrounded, a circle of blue uniforms closing in. He dropped his rifle and pulled his knife. He was going to die. And Clara's mind, which had been at war for weeks, suddenly went perfectly, terribly clear. The conflict was over. The choice was made. She hated him. He had killed her father. He was her captor, and she would not let him die alone. She turned and ran, but she did not run up the path after Iala. She ran back down, back toward the battle, back toward him. Clara! The name was a strangled cry. It was Evans, on the ledge above. He had seen her. He was shouting, but she could not hear his words, only the rage in his voice. She slid down the rock face, scraping her hands raw, her dress tearing. She landed on the canyon floor and ran, her clumsy farm boots stumbling on the loose rock. The soldiers, the ones advancing on Taza, saw her. They stopped, their faces a mask of confusion. A white woman running toward the savage they had cornered. Taza saw her too. His face, which had been a mask of stoic preparation for death, broke. It flooded with a rage so profound it was more terrifying than any bullet. Fool! He roared, his voice cracking. Go back! Sego! She did not stop. She reached him just as he was forcing himself to his feet to meet the charge. He was swaying, his leg useless, blood pouring down his side. No! She screamed at him, at the soldiers, at the sky. She grabbed his arm, the one that held the knife. This way! She did not wait for his answer. She put her shoulder under his arm, taking his weight, and dragged him. She pulled him away from the soldiers toward a narrow split in the canyon wall, a dark crevice she had noticed in her flight. "Clara, stop!" Evans was screaming from above. "That is an order! Men, get her!" The soldiers, their confusion broken, surged forward. A bullet snapped past Clara's head, so close she felt the heat of it. Taza was moving, his left leg dragging, but his will was afire. He was using her as a crutch, his arm heavy on her shoulders. They reached the crevice. It was barely wide enough for one person. Clara shoved him in first. "Go, go!" she panted. He stumbled into the darkness. She followed. Just as the first soldier reached the opening, his bayonet lunging, the steel scraped the rock where she had been a second before. They were in a tunnel, a water cut through the rock, pitch black and narrow. They could hear the soldiers shouting outside, confused, unwilling to follow into the dark. They ran. It was not a run. It was a desperate, stumbling flight. Taza was leaning on her, his breathing a harsh, wet sound in the darkness. "You are a fool," he rasped, his voice thick with pain and fury. "A dead fool." "And you are alive," she shot back, her voice trembling. "Now move." They moved through the darkness for what felt like an eternity. The tunnel twisted, turned, and then, mercifully, opened up. They burst out into the sunlight, into another, smaller canyon. It was a box, a dead end. A sheer, 200-foot wall of red rock rose in front of them. The way they had come was the only way in or out. They were trapped. They could hear the soldiers' voices, echoing from the mouth of the tunnel. They had followed. Taza knew it. He pushed himself away from Clara, his back sliding down the rock wall until he was sitting on the ground. His leg was a ruin. His side was soaked. He was pale, his skin a grayish color beneath the copper. "You should have run," he whispered. His anger was gone, replaced by a vast, cold weariness. "I could not," she said. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his wounds. Useless. He looked at her, his black eyes searching her face, as if seeing her for the first time. "Your father," he began. "Be quiet," she said, her voice breaking. "Save your strength." He gave a short, harsh laugh that turned into a cough. He pressed his hand to his side. "For what to die here?" He looked at his knife, still clutched in his hand. "They will not take me." He began to push himself up the wall, to get to his feet for one last, impossible fight. "Taza, no, wait!" The sound of boots on rock. Lieutenant Evans appeared at the mouth of the canyon, his pistol in his hand. 4 soldiers were with him, their rifles leveled. They stopped, taking in the scene, the desperate, wounded warrior, the white woman, her dress in tatters, her face streaked with dirt and his blood, kneeling beside him. Well, Evans said. His voice was no longer loud. It was soft, silky, and filled with a venom that chilled Clara to the bone. "The traitor and her pet. It seems you have run out of rocks to hide behind." "Clara." Taza, seeing him, found a last reserve of strength. He got 1 foot under him, pushed himself up, and stood, leaning heavily on the rock wall. He raised his knife. He was a cornered wolf ready to die and to take one with him. "It is over," Evans said. He nodded to his men. "Step aside. Clara, my men have orders to shoot him on sight." The 4 soldiers shifted, their rifles aiming not at her, but at Taza, their fingers on the triggers. This was the moment. Her choice on the ledge had been instinct. This was a choice of the soul. Clara stood up. She was trembling, her entire body shaking with exhaustion and a fear so cold it was almost paralyzing. She looked at the blue uniforms, symbols of her old life, of her people, of the law. She looked at Taza, who was swaying, barely conscious, but still defiant, his life draining into the sand. She made her choice. She walked forward and stood directly in front of Taza, her back to his wounded body, her face to the soldiers' rifles. She spread her arms wide, a small, trembling, human shield. "No," she said. Her voice was a whisper, but it echoed in the small, silent canyon. Lieutenant Evans' face, which had been set in a mask of triumph, wavered. "Clara, what in God's name are you doing? Step aside." "No," she said again, louder this time. Her voice found a strength she did not know she possessed. "You will not." "He is a murderer," Evans spat, his composure breaking. "He is a savage. He is the butcher of Providence. He killed your father. Have you gone insane?" The words hit her, the truth of them. She flinched, and her eyes filled with tears. But she did not move. "No," she said, her voice thick. "I have not gone insane. I have forgotten nothing." She looked past Evans, at the 4 soldiers, their faces young, confused, their rifles still aimed. "He is a man," she said, her voice ringing against the stone. "He is wounded. He is beaten. And if you want to kill him, you will have to shoot me first." A terrible, profound silence fell. The soldiers looked at Evans. Evans looked at Clara. His face was a contortion of disbelief, fury, and a strange, sick jealousy. He saw her, this woman who had been his people's, standing as a willing sacrifice for the enemy. "So be it," he said, his voice a low growl. He raised his pistol, aiming it not at Taza, but straight at her heart. "You have made your choice, traitor." Clara stared down the black, unblinking barrel of the gun. She did not move. She did not breathe. Behind her, she heard Taza make a low, animal sound of protest, a sound of pure agony, but he was too weak to move. She closed her eyes and waited. The black, round hole of the pistol barrel was the only still point in Clara's world. It was a perfect, dark circle, a final period at the end of a life she had never asked for. She felt the rough buckskin of Taza's shirt against her back, felt the faint, ragged tremor of his breathing. He was alive, leaning against her. That was all that mattered. Lieutenant Evans' face was a mask of cold fury. His arm was steady. His finger was white on the trigger. "Sir," the voice came from one of the soldiers. It was a young voice, cracking with uncertainty. He was a private, barely old enough to grow a beard, and his rifle was no longer aimed at her. It was pointing at the ground. "What is it, Private?" Evans said, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. He did not take his eyes off Clara. "Sir, she is a white woman. We cannot just—" "She is a traitor," Evans spat. "She is a collaborator. She has chosen that savage over her own people. She is no better than he is. Now step aside, Clara, or so help me God. I will put a bullet through you to get to him." Clara's eyes had been closed. She opened them. The tears had come. But they were not tears of fear. They were tears of a terrible, final clarity. She looked past the pistol, into the blue eyes of the lieutenant. "You are right," she whispered. Her voice was a dry, broken sound, but in the silence of the box canyon, it was as loud as a shout. Evans flinched. This was not the defiance he expected. "What did you say?" "You are right," she said again, louder. "He is a murderer. He killed my father." The private stared at her, his mouth open. Evans's pistol wavered. "Just a fraction." Behind her, she felt Taza's body go rigid, a sharp intake of breath. "I saw him do it," Clara continued, the words tearing out of her. "I was standing in the doorway. He was trying to reload his rifle, and Taza killed him. I knelt in my father's blood. I have hated him for it every day since. I hate him for it now." She paused, her gaze moving from Evans to the 4 soldiers, one by one. She was not begging, she was testifying. "But I have also seen what you have not," she said, her voice gathering a strength she did not know she possessed. "You call him a butcher. You hunt him. You call him a savage. But you do not know why he fights. You have never asked. You just came, with your forts and your rifles, and decided this land was yours. Clara, Evans warned, raising his pistol again, his face darkening. No, she said, cutting him off. You will listen. You say he butchered Providence. He came for food, for flour, for coffee, because his people are starving, because your army has pushed them from the valleys, killed their buffalo, and left them to die in these rocks. I saw the food he took. It was barely enough to feed a dozen children. And for that, my father is dead. For that, this war keeps going. She took a shaky breath, the tears now rolling freely down her dust-caked cheeks. You call him a monster, but a monster does not give his own share of food to an old man who is dying. A monster does not walk into a fight where he is outnumbered 60-1, just to buy his family a few seconds to escape. A monster does not risk his life to save a woman he hates. She pointed a trembling finger, not at Evans, but at the private. He saw. He was on the ledge. His soldier aimed at me. Taza was down, wounded, with your men closing in. He was going to die, but he saw that rifle, and he fired. He saved my life. He saved me, a white woman, his captive, his enemy. She finally turned her gaze back to Evans, whose arm had now dropped, his pistol pointing at the sand. His face was a map of confusion and rage. You see a savage, she said, her voice dropping to a low, trembling intensity. I see a man. I see a man with more honor than you will ever know. He is fighting for his home. He is dying for his family. And you, in your blue uniform, you are the ones who are the butchers. She stopped, her chest heaving. She had said it, all of it. The truth, the final, terrible truth came out, and she felt a strange, light-headed emptiness. And yes, she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost. I love him for it. I love him. The words hung in the air, a confession that was also a death sentence. So, if you are going to shoot him, she said, her voice flat, you will have to shoot me, because my life is his. It is all I have left. No one moved. The silence that followed was profound. It was broken by the sound of 3 rifles clattering on the rock. The other soldiers, following the private's lead, had lowered their weapons. Sir, the private said, his voice no longer shaking, but steady. I will not. She is an American citizen, and she is unarmed. Another soldier, a corporal with a grizzled face, nodded. He is wounded, Lieutenant, badly. He is no threat to anyone. We can take him prisoner. We can take them both. Lieutenant Evans stood there. His authority, his certainty, his entire world, shattered by this one. Half-starved, tattered woman. He looked at Clara, at her defiant, tear-streaked face. He looked at Taza, who was sagging against the wall, his eyes closed, his life's blood staining the sand. He looked at his own men, their faces set, their mutiny quiet but absolute. He was beaten. He could not shoot her. He could not order his men to shoot her. And if he shot Taza, his men would testify. His career would be over. He let out a long, ragged breath, and all the fury in his face collapsed into a mask of pure, reptilian hatred. He holstered his pistol. Fine, he spat, the word thick with venom. Fine, she is not worth the powder. Corporal, bind him, bind them both. They will stand trial at the fort. He will hang as a murderer, and she will hang as a collaborator. This was his only move. Not a battlefield execution, but a legal one. The Army's decision was made. They were not saved. They were prisoners, of a different, more final kind. He is wounded, Clara said, her voice hollow, as the corporal and the private moved forward. Do not hurt him. The private looked at her, his young face filled with a confused pity. We will be gentle, ma'am. As Clara stepped aside, Taza's last ounce of strength left him. He did not fight, did not even open his eyes. He simply collapsed forward. A dead weight. The soldiers caught him before he hit the ground. They bound his hands in front of him, gently, as they would a wounded comrade. They were marched out of the box canyon, back into the main pass. Taza was carried between the two soldiers. Clara walked behind, her hands unbound, but she was as much a prisoner as he was. When they emerged from the narrow pass, the rest of the cavalry company was there, waiting, their horses blowing, their faces flushed with the victory of having scattered the Apache. A cheer went up. They got him. They got Taza. And then they saw her. A man in buckskins, a civilian scout she recognized from Providence. A man named Miller pushed his way forward. His face was a picture of disbelief and joy. "Clara! My God, it is Clara Whitmore. She is alive. We thought you were dead." Men surged forward, their faces filled with relief, with joy at her rescue. "It is her. She is safe." Clara stopped, her heart aching. These were her people. This was her community. They were looking at her as if she were a miracle. Lieutenant Evans pushed past her, his face a thundercloud. He held up his hand, silencing the crowd. "She is alive," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "But she is not safe, and she is not one of us." The joy on Miller's face froze. "Sir, what do you mean?" "I mean," Evans said, his voice cold and loud for all to hear, "that we found Miss Whitmore shielding this murderer with her own body." A collective gasp, a ripple of disbelief went through the soldiers. "I gave her a direct order to step aside," Evans continued, his voice righteous and damning. "She refused. She stood between our rifles and the man who butchered her own father. She told us we would have to kill her to get to him. She is a traitor, a collaborator, an Apache lover." The word lover was the final, twisting knife. Miller looked at her, his face, which had been so kind, so full of relief, contorted. It became a mask of disgust, of a horror far deeper than if he had found her body. "Clara," he whispered, his voice choked. "Is that true, after what they did, after what he did to your pa?" She looked at him, at his accusing eyes, at the circle of faces that had, a moment before, been her rescuers. Now, they were her jury. They were her executioners. "He is not—" she began, but her voice faltered. What could she say? How could she explain? "Do not speak to her," Evans commanded. "She is a prisoner of the United States Army. She will be tried for treason." "Treason," someone muttered. "She is no better than them," another voice growled. "Let her hang," a third had said. "Let her hang right next to him." This was the price. This was the betrayal. She had made her choice, and her community. The world she had been born into had just pronounced its sentence. She had lost everything. Her father, her home, and now, her people. They slung Taza over a horse, his body limp, a piece of cargo. Clara looked at him. He was alive. His chest was rising and falling. That was all that was left. She straightened her back. She had faced down a pistol. She would face this. She looked at Miller, at Evans, at the wall of hating, accusing eyes. She lifted her chin. She was Clara Whitmore. She was not a traitor. She was a woman who had seen the truth. She began to walk, a prisoner, surrounded by her own people, who were now her greatest enemies. The ride to the fort was 10 miles of silent humiliation. Clara walked, her feet, shod in the worn farm boots she had been wearing when she was captured, stumbled over the rocks, her ankles twisting, but she did not feel the pain. She was numb, wrapped in a cold, hard shell of her own making. The soldiers formed a hollow square around her. They did not speak to her. They did not look at her. They were a wall of blue, their faces grim and set. The brief moment of pity the private had shown her was gone. burned away by the public shame of Evans's denouncement. She was a pariah. Ahead of her, Taza was slung over his own horse, tied on like a sack of feed. He was unconscious, or near to it, his head hanging down, his black hair matted with dust and his own blood. With every jolt of the horse, a small, dark drop fell to the dust. He was dying. The thought was a cold, sharp point in her numbness. She had saved him from a bullet only to watch him bleed to death. Lieutenant Evans rode at the head of the column, his back straight, his authority restored. He had won. He had captured the infamous Taza, and he had exposed the traitor, Clara Whitmore. When they rode through the high gates of Fort Grant, he was a conquering hero. The fort was a world of harsh angles, of sawn timber and packed earth. It was a place of total, unyielding order. Soldiers stopped their work, their faces turning. As the column entered the parade ground, a cheer went up. It is Taza. They have him. The cheer died almost instantly as they saw Clara, walking behind the horse, her dress in tack underscorders, her face a mask of dirt and dried blood. Her hands unbound, but her status as prisoner obvious. The men's faces, which had been joyful at the sight of a rescued captive, hardened into the same mask of confusion and disgust she had seen on the Scout. Miller. Put the savage in the stockade, Evans commanded, his voice ringing with triumph. He can await the hangman there. And put the woman in the holding cell. She will stand trial for treason. 2 soldiers moved to cut Taza's bonds and drag him from the horse. Clara's numbness broke. "No," she said, her voice a raw croak. She ran forward, past the guards who were too surprised to stop her, and put her hand on the horse. "You cannot. He is dying." She looked up, not at Evans, but at the faces of the soldiers. "He is bleeding to death. You cannot put him in a stockade. He needs a doctor." "He is a murderer, Miss Whitmore," Evans said, his voice laced with contempt as he dismounted. "He will get the justice he deserves. He will hang." "He cannot hang if he is dead," Clara said, her voice desperate. She grabbed the arm of the private who had spoken up for her in the canyon. "Please, you saw him. He is gravely wounded. Is this your justice, to let a man bleed to death in the dirt?" The private, Harris, looked away, his face pale, trapped between his duty and his conscience. "Lieutenant!" The new voice was not loud, but it cut through the chaos like a razor. A man had stepped off the porch of the commander's office. He was older than Evans, perhaps 50 years, with a gray-streaked beard and the impassive, sun-scorched face of a man who had spent his entire life on the frontier. He wore the eagles of a colonel. This was Colonel Davis, the post commander. Lieutenant Evans?" the colonel said, his voice flat. "Report. What is the meaning of this circus?" Evans strode forward, saluting. "Sir, we engaged the enemy at Red Rock Canyon. We have captured their leader, Taza. The band has been scattered. The threat is neutralized." "An exemplary report," Colonel Davis said, his eyes not on Evans, but on Clara. "And this, I assume this is Miss Whitmore. Why is she not being tended to? Why are you calling her a trial subject?" Evans's face tightened. "Sir, it is a delicate matter. We found Miss Whitmore compromised. She has turned. She sided with the savage against my men. I have arrested her as a collaborator." The colonel's gaze, which had been cold, sharpened. He looked at Clara, really looked at her defiant chin, her trembling body, her eyes that held no fear, only a desperate plea. "She says he is dying," the colonel said. "He is," Clara said, her voice finding its strength. "He was shot twice. His old wound is reopened. He has lost too much blood." Colonel Davis looked at the limp form on the horse. He was a practical man, not a vindictive one. "Sergeant," he called, "take the prisoner to the infirmary. Have Dr. Hayes see to him. Post 2 guards on the door." He is a prisoner, not a carcass. If he is to hang, he will hang healthy. He turned back to Evans. Lieutenant, Miss Whitmore. My office, now. Clara's knees almost buckled in relief. She watched as two soldiers, with a rough gentleness, lifted Taza from the horse and carried him toward the small adobe building with a cross on the door. Then, with a soldier walking behind her, she followed Evans and the colonel into the small, dark office. Sit, Colonel Davis said to her. He did not sit himself. He stood behind his desk, a plain plank of wood. Lieutenant, your full report. Evans told the story. He told it as a hero. He had tracked the Apache, cornered them. He described the battle, the capture, and then he came to her. Sir, I found Miss Whitmore on a ledge with the hostiles. I gave her a direct order, as a citizen, to come to my position. She refused. She fled with the enemy. When we cornered Taza, she ran back through the line of fire, and shielded him with her own body. She confessed to an allegiance. She told my men they would have to shoot her to get to him. She is a traitor, sir. Plain and simple. Colonel Davis was silent for a long moment. His fingers steepled. He looked at Clara. Miss Whitmore, you have heard the lieutenant's report. You are an American citizen. You are the daughter of Jedediah Whitmore, a good man who was murdered by this savage. And yet you shielded him. You must understand the gravity of this. Treason is a capital offense. Tell me why I should not have you bound in irons. This was it. Not the canyon, but here, this small, hot, dark room. This was the real trial. Clara sat up straight. She was exhausted, filthy, and her heart was a leaden weight. But she was not beaten. What Lieutenant Evans says is true, she said, her voice clear. Evans looked triumphant. The colonel's face hardened. It is true, Clara continued, that I stood in front of Taza. It is true that I refused the lieutenant's order. It is true that he killed my father. She looked the colonel in the eye. And it is also true that he is the only man of honor I have met in this God-forsaken land. Evans lunged forward. Sir, this is insanity. She is sick. Be silent, Lieutenant, Davis said, his voice sharp. He looked at Clara. Explain yourself, Miss Whitmore, and choose your words with care. So she told him. She told him everything. She did not speak of love. She spoke of facts. He fights, Colonel, because you are starving his people. His children are eating roots and bark. The raid on Providence, it was not for murder. It was for flour. I saw the supplies. It was a pathetic handful of food. And for that, my town burned. But he did not keep that food for himself. I saw him, with my own eyes, give his entire share to a dying elder. She told him about Dakota, about the hatred of the other warriors. I was his enemy, a burden, another man. Dakota tried to kill me. Taza stopped him. He shamed his own warrior to protect me, his captive. She told him of the storm. He found me freezing to death. He brought me into his own home, gave me his own furs, and sat with his back to me all night. He said he was protecting his trade, but he could have let me die. It would have been easier for him. And then she told him of the battle. When your soldiers had me on the ledge, one of them aimed his rifle at me. At me, sir. Not at an Apache, and Taza, who was wounded, who was facing 60 rifles. He saw it, and he fired. He shot that soldier, not to kill, but to save my life. He saved me, while your men were trying to kill me. Evans's face had gone pale. And then, Clara said, her voice dropping, when I stood in front of him, Lieutenant Evans did not just ask me to move. He did not just arrest me. He aimed his pistol at my heart. He was going to execute me, an unarmed woman, his own countrymen, his men. They are the ones who saved me. They refused his order. The silence in the room was absolute. Colonel Davis turned his head, very slowly, to look at Lieutenant Evans. His eyes were no longer cold. They were chips of ice. "Lieutenant, is that true? Did you threaten to execute an American citizen?"
"Sir, she was hysterical. A traitor.
"Did you aim your weapon at an unarmed civilian?" "Lieutenant—" Evans's mouth opened and closed.
Sir,
"My judgment. That will be all." "Lieutenant," Davis said, his voice deadly quiet, "you are relieved of your command. You are confined to your quarters until I have a full hearing on your conduct in this matter. Corporal Barnes and Private Harris will be giving me their own reports. I suggest you pray their version aligns with yours. Get out." Evans, his face white with a rage that was now impotent, saluted, his hand shaking. He turned on his heel and left the office, slamming the door behind him. Colonel Davis stared at the closed door for a long time. He sighed, a sound of profound weariness, and finally sat down. He looked at Clara. "Miss Whitmore, it seems you have been through an ordeal I cannot begin to imagine." His tone was different. It was the voice of a man, not just a commander. "You are not a prisoner," he said. "You are a free woman. You are a citizen under the protection of this fort. You are cleared of all suspicion." Clara's body slumped. It was over. She was safe. She was free. "We can arrange transport," the colonel continued, his voice kind. "A supply wagon is leaving for Santa Fe in 3 days. From there, you can get a stagecoach. Go back east. Go to your family. Forget this. All of this ever happened." East, the word was a chimera, a green, civilized place, a world of parlors and teacups, and men who did not kill, and women who were not traitors. It was the cage she had always yearned to escape, and it was now being offered to her as a rescue. She was free. She could walk out of this fort. She could go home. But home was a pile of ashes. Her father was dead, and the man who had murdered him, the man who had saved her, the man she had confessed to loving, was in the next building, dying on a surgeon's table. She looked at the colonel. "I am free," she said. "Yes, but he is not." Colonel Davis's face hardened again. The kindness was gone. "No, he is not. He is a prisoner of war, and he will stand trial for the murder of your father and the others at Providence. And he will be found guilty." Clara stated, "Yes, the law is clear. He will hang." She had saved him from a bullet, only to deliver him to a rope. This was her victory. It tasted like ashes. "Colonel," she said, leaning forward, "when you captured Taza, you did not just capture a warrior." "I know what he is. Miss Whitmore, he is a leader." "He is the leader," she insisted. "He is the only man holding that band together. He is the only one who fights with reason. He is not a fanatic." She thought of Dakota, his face twisted with hate. "The man who will replace him, Dakota, he is—" "You hang Taza, and this war will not end. It will truly begin. The man you have in your infirmary is the only man in this territory who can stop this war. He is the only one who will listen. He is the only one they will follow. You do not have a murderer. Colonel, you have a peace." Davis stared at her. His eyes narrowed. He was a soldier. He understood war. And she was, he realized, speaking his language. Strategy, not emotion. "What you are suggesting, that is a matter for generals. For Washington. Not for a post commander." "But he has to be alive for them to decide." Clara pressed, her voice urgent. "If he dies on that table, or on your gallows, the choice is gone. You will be fighting Dakota for 20 years. How many more farms will have to burn? How many more fathers?" The colonel was silent. He looked at this strange, fierce woman. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the steel in her spine. She was right. It was a strategic reality he had not yet considered. "He is gravely wounded," Davis said, thinking aloud. Dr. Hayes is a fine surgeon, but he is one man.
I am here,
Clara said. He looked at her. What? I am not going east. I am not leaving this fort. I am the only one. I am the only one he knows. I helped him when he was wounded before. I am here to help. I will be his nurse. I will be his interpreter. I will be whatever you need. But I am not leaving him. This was her final choice. It was not a choice made in a moment of gunfire and panic. It was a choice made in a quiet, dark room. She was free, and she was choosing to stay. She was choosing him. Colonel Davis looked at her for a long, hard minute. He saw her resolve. He saw her value. Very well, Miss Whitmore, he said, standing. Your, status is irregular, but your reasoning is sound. The prisoner must be kept alive. Dr. Hayes will need the help. You will report to him. You will be given quarters. You will be under guard when you are with the prisoner, but you are a free woman. He opened the door for her. She stepped out onto the parade ground. The sun was setting, painting the mesas a deep, bruised purple. It was the same sky she had looked at from her farm, a lifetime ago. She walked across the dusty ground to the infirmary. She pushed open the door. The small room smelled of whiskey and blood and carbolic. Taza was on a narrow cot, his body terribly still. Dr. Hayes, a weary man with blood up to his elbows, was bent over him, clamping an artery. He looked up as she entered, his face annoyed. Who in the hell are you? Clara picked up a clean cloth from a table and walked to the cot. I am Clara Whitmore, she said. I am here to help. She dipped the cloth in a bowl of water and, for the second time, began to clean the blood from Taza's skin. Dr. Hayes was a man who believed in whiskey, carbolic, and sutures. In that precise order, he worked for 2 hours without speaking, his hands a blur of swift, efficient motion. He dug out a musket ball from Taza's leg and clamped and stitched the reopened wound in his side, which had been torn by a piece of shrapnel. Clara was his instrument. She held the clamps. She swabbed the blood. She threaded the needles, her hands steady, her face a pale, determined mask. She did not flinch. She had seen animals butchered, and this was not so different. It was just meat and blood, and a life that was leaking away. When the doctor was finally done, he stepped back, wiping his hands on a cloth that was already stiff with gore. Well, he grunted, looking at Taza's still form. I have done all I can. The rest is up to God and his constitution, and he appears to have the constitution of a damn bull. Taza was breathing. It was shallow, but it was steady. His body, cleaned of the battle's grime, was a map of old scars and new, raw wounds. He was pale, but the grayish, deathly color was gone. He will be chained, Dr. Hayes said, as if it were part of the medical procedure. He nodded to the 2 guards who stood at the door, their faces rigid. They came in and fastened a heavy iron manacle to Taza's left ankle, securing the chain to a ring bolted to the floor. Colonel's orders. He is a prisoner. First, a patient. Second, do not forget that. Miss Whitmore. I will not, Clara said. You will have the cot in the storage room. The doctor continued, gesturing to a small door. You will be under guard. You are not to leave this building without an escort. You are not a prisoner, but you are not free to wander. Am I clear? Yes, doctor. Good. I am going to get a drink. A large one. Call me if he wakes up and tries to tear out his stitches, or kill you. He left. Thus began Clara's new life. It was a life contained in 2 small rooms, the infirmary, which smelled of sickness and lie, and her small, windowless closet, which held a narrow cot. She was a pariah. The soldiers who guarded her, a rotation of men, never spoke to her. They delivered her meals, a plate of beans and hardtack, and set it on the floor inside the door. as if she were a dog. They followed her when she used the necessary, and they stood with their rifles ready when she was near Taza. The rest of the fort was a wall of silent, accusing hatred. She was the traitor, the Apache lover. The women of the fort, the few laundresses and the sergeant's wife, would cross the dusty parade ground to avoid walking on the same side of the street as the infirmary. When she was allowed out for an hour of air, under guard. Children who had been taught to revere the rescued Miss Whitmore now threw stones at her, their faces twisted into masks of adult hatred. Traitor, they hissed, their voices high and sharp. She had lost her community. The very people she had once identified as her own now saw her as a monster, a creature who had betrayed her race and her sex. The scout, Miller, who had once looked at her with such kindness, now just stared from the saloon porch, his face filled with a cold, righteous disgust. She was utterly, profoundly alone. Except for him, Taza did not wake for 2 days. He was lost in a deep, healing darkness. Clara sat by his cot, a constant, silent presence. She bathed his face. She kept his wounds clean. She watched the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. The hatred of the fort was a raging fire outside, but in the small, quiet room, there was only the sound of his breathing. She was no longer his captive. She was his nurse, his jailer, and, in a way, his fellow prisoner. They were two set against all others. On the 3rd morning, she was wringing out a cloth in a bowl of cool water when his eyes opened. There was no slow drift to consciousness. One moment, he was gone. The next, he was there. His eyes were black, sharp, and instantly aware. They fixed on her. He did not speak. He just looked. He saw her. The plain cotton dress the doctor had found for her. Her hair pulled back, her face pale. He saw the room, the walls, the cot. Then his gaze moved, and he saw the chain on his ankle. A sound ripped from his chest. It was a low, animal growl. He lunged, his entire body coiling with a power that defied his wounds, and was brought up short by the chain. It snapped taut, the ring in the floor groaning. The motion tore at his stitches. A line of fresh, bright blood blossomed on the bandage around his side. "No," Clara said, moving forward. "Stop! You will kill yourself." He turned his fury on her. "You!" he snarled. The word was a curse. He spoke in Apache, the words guttural, unknown to her, but their meaning was clear. He was filled with a black, bottomless rage. "Taza, be still. You are wounded." "This is your doing," he said, switching to the harsh, broken English they shared. "You, Dunji-e, traitor!" The word from his lips struck her harder than any stone. He did not see her as his savior. He saw her as his final humiliation. He, Taza, the D-Yin, chained to a floor, captured, not by the warriors who had outnumbered him, but by the weakness of a white woman. I did not mean for this," she stammered. "You meant for this," he hissed, rattling the chain. "A dog. You made me a dog." He was ashamed. His pride, which was as much a part of him as his bones, was broken. To be a captive was one thing. To be a captive displayed in a cage, tended by the very woman who was the symbol of his enemy, was an agony worse than any wound. He turned his face to the wall, and he did not speak again. He refused to eat. When she brought him the thin broth, he would not open his mouth. When she brought him water, he knocked the cup from her hand. The guards outside heard the clatter and leveled their rifles, but Clara just shook her head. He was trying to die. He had been denied a warrior's death, so he was choosing this. Dr. Hayes came in. "If he will not eat, he will die," the doctor said, his voice flat. "It is no matter to me. It saves the hangman a rope." Clara stared at Taza's rigid back. He was giving up, and she, who had given up everything for him, felt a sudden, cold rage. She waited until the doctor left. She walked to the cot. The guards tensed.
You are a coward,
she said, her voice low and shaking. His head snapped around, his eyes blazing. He lunged again, as far as the chain would allow, his hand grasping for her, his fingers inches from her throat. She did not move.
You are a coward,
she said again, her voice steady now.
The great Taza, the leader, the man who gives his food to an elder, the man who fights 60 to 1. You are so brave.
You would rather starve in a bed than face what you have done. What I have done, he growled. What we have done, she said.
Did you think my life was easy? Do you think I am not a prisoner here?
She gestured to the guards, to the barred window.
I am a traitor. My own people spit on me. I have no home. I have no family. I gave my name, my life, my father's memory. I gave it all up. For you, in that canyon. And you are so weak, so filled with pride,
that you would throw it all away because of a chain on your foot. He stared at her, his chest heaving, his eyes searching her face. He was seeing her, truly seeing her. For the first time, he saw the shadows under her eyes, the hard line of her mouth. He saw the woman who had stood in front of a pistol for him. Why? He whispered, the rage draining, leaving only a vast, hollow confusion. Why? Because you were dying, she said.
It was my right to die.
And it was my choice to stop it, she said. She picked up the cup of water, her hand not trembling.
This is not about your pride,
Taza. This is about your people, I told the colonel. I told him everything. He frowned, not understanding. I told him you were not a monster. I told him you were a leader. I told him that if he hangs you, the war will never end. Dakota will lead them, and he will lead them to ruin. Your people will all die. His face, which had been a mask of defiance, wavered. He understood this. He understood strategy. He understood his duty. I told him, Clara said, kneeling beside the cot, the water in her hand, that you were the only man who could make peace, that you were the only one who could save them. I stayed here as a prisoner, as a traitor, to keep you alive. Not for you, not for me, for them, for Iyala, for the children. He was silent. He looked at her, his gaze so intense it was a physical weight. He saw the truth of her words. She had not saved him out of some weak, womanly pity. She had made a strategic choice. She had acted as a leader. He was in her debt, a debt of life, a debt of honor. Slowly, his jaw unclenching, he reached out his hand, not to strike, not to grab. He took the cup of water. He drank. The war was not over, but their private battle was. In the weeks that followed, a new, strange alliance was forged in that small room. Taza began to heal. His body, fed and tended, mended with the same fierce will he had once used to fight. He was a difficult patient, silent and brooding. But he did what Clara said. He ate, he let her change his bandages, and he watched her. Clara, in turn, became his shield. She was his only link to the world outside. She was his interpreter, his advocate, his only ally. Colonel Davis came, as he had promised. He stood over Taza's cot, his face grim. Clara stood beside him. Ask him, the colonel said, if he will speak for his people. Clara translated. Taza looked at the colonel, his gaze filled with a cold, ancient hatred. I will speak, he said. And so, the talking began. It was not a negotiation. It was a series of demands and refusals, a hard, bitter argument that spanned days. But it was talking. For the first time, a white commander was speaking to Taza as a man, not as a target, and Taza was speaking back. Clara was the bridge, her voice translating not just the words, but the meaning, softening the insults, clarifying the threats, finding the small, hidden cracks where a compromise might grow. The fort still hated her. But the hatred was now tinged with a grudging, fearful respect. She was not just the Apache's lover. She was the Apache's voice. She was the only thing standing between the fort and a renewed, bloodier war. One afternoon, a soldier announced that a parley was at the gate. An Apache woman, alone, under a white flag. It was Ayala. Colonel Davis allowed it. Ayala was brought to the infirmary. The guards stood, tensed. Ayala walked in, her ancient face a mask. She saw Taza sitting on the edge of his cot, his leg in a splint, his side bandaged, but alive. He was thin, but his eyes were clear. Then she saw Clara, standing beside him, not behind him, as a slave, but beside him. Ayala looked at Clara. She looked at her for a long, hard minute. She saw the new dress, the clean hair. She saw the authority in her stance. She saw the way the soldier at the door watched her. Then she looked at Taza, and she looked back at Clara, and she understood. She began to speak, her voice sharp. To Taza, he replied, his voice low. Clara did not need to translate. It was a flood of grief. Dakota was a fool. He had led the people into a box canyon. They were starving. The children were dying. It was over. Taza's face was a mask of pain. He looked at Clara. "Tell her," he said. "Tell her what?" "Tell her what you did." Clara took a breath. She looked at the old woman who had slapped her, who had hated her. She told her story. She told her about the battle. She told her about standing in front of the rifles. She told her about the choice she had made, to give up her own people to save him, to save them. When she was finished, Ayala was silent. She looked at Clara, and the hatred was gone. It was replaced by a look of profound, stunned respect. It was the same look Taza had given her. Ayala stepped forward. She, the proud Apache matriarch, reached out a gnarled hand, and she touched Clara's arm, just a brief touch. "My daughter," she said, the English words rough. It was not an endearment. It was an adoption, a statement of fact. She had sacrificed as an Apache would. She was, in the only way that mattered, one of them. The mending had begun. Clara looked at Taza. He was watching her, his face no longer hard. He had seen it. His two worlds, his people and this woman, had just touched. She had chosen her path. She was not a white woman. She was not an Apache. She was Clara. She was the woman who loved Taza. She was the woman who stood in the middle. She was no longer bound by any rules but her own. She was, at last, in this prison, completely and totally free. The touch from Ayala was a brand. It was not a forgiveness, for Clara had done nothing wrong. It was an acceptance, a knitting of bone, as real and as painful as the healing of Taza's leg. In that moment, in the small, stinking room of the infirmary, the world shifted. The guards at the door were still there. The fort outside still hated her, but Clara was no longer alone. She had a people. Dr. Hayes, finding Ayala by the cot, had tried to eject her. Clara had simply stood in his way. "She is his family. Doctor, she stays." The doctor, outnumbered by two formidable women, had merely grunted and left them be. Ayala stayed for 2 days. She and Clara did not speak. Not truly, they communicated in the way women do when there is work. They tended to Taza. Ayala knew herbs and poultices that worked faster than the doctor's carbolic. Clara provided the clean water, the broth, the bandages. They were a team. And Taza was silent. He watched them. He saw his world, the old and the new, working together over his broken body. He saw the strength of the woman he had stolen, and the strength of the woman who had raised him. He saw his path. When Ayala left, she did not say goodbye. She simply nodded once to Taza, and then again. That same sharp, respectful nod to Clara. She walked out of the infirmary, a straight-backed, proud old woman, her parley complete. Taza was healing. The iron constitution the doctor had noted was real. He began to sit up. He would test the strength in his leg. His face a mask of pain as the muscles knit. The chain was a constant, dull ringing, a counterpoint to every move he made. Colonel Davis came every morning. The talks continued. Clara was the center. "He says his people are starving," Clara translated, though Taza sat not 5 feet from the colonel. "He says Dakota is a hothead, but he is not a fool. If the people starve, he will raid. He must." "And I say," the colonel replied, his voice firm, "that he is in no position to make demands. He is a prisoner. His people are a broken band." Taza spoke, his voice low. Clara translated, "He says, you can break a band. You cannot break a people. You can hang me. You will not stop the hunger. You will only create a martyr." "He is a smart man, for a savage," Davis muttered. "He is a smart man," Clara corrected, her voice sharp. "That is why you must listen." The negotiation was brutal. It lasted a week. Clara felt as though she were being torn in two, stretched between these two men, these two worlds. But she was the bridge. Finally, the colonel made his offer. "There is a valley, 2 moons. It is good land, water, shelter. His people may have it." Clara's heart leaped. She told Taza. Taza's face did not change. He spoke one word. "A cage," Clara translated, her heart sinking. "A life," the colonel retorted. "It is that, or it is the reservation at San Carlos, which is a hellhole. Or it is this war, until every man, woman, and child of his band is dead. Those are the choices." Taza was silent for a long time. He looked at the chain on his leg. He looked at Clara. He saw the future, a hard, narrow path. It was the only one. He spoke, his voice heavy. "My people will go. I will lead them. But they must have food. They must have seed. And the soldiers must stay out. It must be our land." "The army will provide rations," the colonel said. "And the valley will be theirs. As long as the peace is kept. No raids, no more blood." "And me?" Taza asked, his eyes hard. "Do I lead them with this chain?" Colonel Davis looked at him. "You, Taza, are a murderer. You are charged with the deaths of no less than 12 settlers, including Jedediah Whitmore." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "I cannot pardon you," the colonel said. "But the general, he is a practical man. He wants this war over. He has authorized me to commute your sentence. You will not hang. You will lead your people to the 2 Moons Valley, and you will remain there. You will be their leader, but you will also be their prisoner. If you ever leave that valley, you will be shot on sight. That is the peace." It was a life sentence, but it was a life. Taza looked at Clara. He had seen her flinch at her father's name. This was the chasm between them, the river of blood that could not be crossed. He had taken her life. Now, she had given him his. The debt was strange and terrible. He nodded once. "I accept." The next day, the fort was a hive of activity. A supply wagon was loaded with flour, bacon, coffee, and seed corn. Taza, his leg now strong enough to bear his weight with a heavy limp, was brought out onto the parade ground. His chain was struck from the floor ring, but the manacle remained on his ankle, a short, 10-link chain dangling from it, a symbol. He was still a prisoner. Iala was there, and what was left of the band, perhaps 50 people, their faces thin, their eyes hollow with hunger and despair. They saw their leader, alive, and a murmur of hope went through them. Dakota was there, his face a mask of sullen, hateful rage. He saw Taza limping, chained, and he saw Clara, standing beside him. He spat on the ground. Clara was no longer a prisoner. She was, as the colonel had said,
a free woman. She was also a pariah. The soldiers, the wives, the scouts, they watched her, their eyes cold. Lieutenant Evans had been sent back east in disgrace, but the poison he had spread remained. Miller, the scout, just shook his head. "A damn shame," he muttered to another man. "Jedediah's girl, look at her, standing with him." Colonel Davis approached her. He was not unkind. "Miss Whitmore, you have done this territory a great service. A wagon is being prepared. It leaves for Santa Fe in 1 hour. You will have a full military escort. From there, you can go home, back east. This is all over." She looked at him. Home. The word was a ghost. It meant nothing. She looked at the wagon, at the promise of green hills and clean sheets and polite society. A cage. Then she looked at Taza. He was standing straight, his new limp a permanent part of him. He was ignoring the glares of the soldiers, the hatred of Dakota. He was looking at his people, his face set, ready to take up his burden. He had not looked at her. He had not spoken to her since he had accepted the terms. The debt was too great. The murder of her father stood between them like a wall of stone. He would live, and she would go. It was the only way. She was free. She could leave. Taza turned, ready to lead his people out of the gate. He took one step, the short chain rattling. He stopped. He turned his head, and his eyes found hers across the parade ground. He did not speak. He did not beckon. He simply waited. His gaze was not a command. It was a question. She looked at the wagon. She looked at him. She knew, with a certainty that was as calm and deep as the desert sky, that her old life was gone. Her father was gone. Her home was gone. Her people had rejected her. She had nothing. And she looked at the man who had taken everything from her. He was all she had left. He was her captor, her enemy, her patient, her ally. He was the man she had stood in front of a pistol for. He was the man she loved. She turned to Colonel Davis. "Thank you, Colonel, but I am not going to Santa Fe." Davis frowned. "Miss Whitmore, there is no place for you here. You cannot stay at this fort." "I know," she said. She walked away from him. She crossed the parade ground, every step a choice. The soldiers stared, their mouths open. Miller swore, a low, disgusted sound. Dakota's hand went to his knife, his eyes blazing. She did not stop until she was standing in front of Taza. She looked up at him, at his stark, carved face. "I am coming with you," she said. It was not a request. It was a statement. He looked down at her. His black eyes searched her face. "You are a white woman. You are free. My life is this." He pointed to the valley. "A cage. My people. They hate you." "Your people," Clara said, her voice steady, "are my people. Iala calls me daughter. I will earn the name. I am not a white woman. I am not an Apache. I am just me, and my place is where you are." His face, which had been a mask of stone, softened. The pain, the guilt, the hard lines of his life, they were all there, but they were joined by something else, a light, a hope, "Your father," he whispered, his voice rough. I know," she said, and her own voice broke, the grief still raw. "I will live with that. We both will. But I will not live without you." He held her gaze for a long, profound moment. The world, the fort, the soldiers, the hatred. It all fell away. There was only the two of them, standing in the sunlight. Two broken pieces that made a whole. He did not smile. He did not touch her. He simply nodded. Once, a full acceptance. He turned to the guard who held the key to his manacle. "She is with me," he said. "The chain. Take it off." The soldier looked at Colonel Davis. The colonel, watching from his porch, sighed. It was the end of a war.
It was the start of something he did not understand. But he was a practical man. He nodded. The soldier unlocked the iron. It fell to the dust with a heavy, final sound. Taza was free. He rubbed his ankle, the skin raw beneath. Then he turned, not to Clara, but to his people. He raised his arm. "We go." He began to walk, his limp pronounced, his back straight. He led his people out of the gates of the fort. Clara waited 1 second. Then she fell into step, not behind him, as a captive, but beside him. The journey to the Two Moons Valley took 3 days. They walked, a long, silent column of refugees, guarded by the very soldiers they had fought. Dakota and his men walked at the back, their hatred a palpable thing. Clara walked with Iala, helping the old woman, carrying one of the children. Taza walked at the head, alone, his silence a wall. They did not speak, not of what she had done, not of her father. There were no words for it. The valley was beautiful, green, with a clear river, sheltered by high red cliffs. It was a good place. It was also a prison. Soldiers were already building a blockhouse on the canyon rim. The people, weary to their bones, simply stopped and began to build. They began to remake their lives. Clara and Taza stood on a small rise, watching. The sun was setting, painting the cliffs the color of blood. "It is a hard place," he said, his first words to her alone. "We have had a hard life," she replied. He turned to her. The sun was in his eyes, but she could see the pain there, the unresolved guilt. "What I did." "We will not speak of it," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It is the past. This," she gestured to the valley, to the people, "is the future. We will build it, together." He looked at her, at this strange, strong woman who had saved him in every way a person could be saved. He did not know how to love. He only knew how to fight, how to lead, how to survive. He reached out his hand. It was not a gesture he had ever made before. It was hesitant. The hand of a warrior, calloused and scarred. He did not touch her face. He did not touch her hair. He laid his hand, very gently, on her shoulder. It was a claim. It was an acceptance. It was a promise. Clara covered his hand with her own, her fingers lacing with his. They stood there for a long time as the sun set. The two of them, the murderer and the traitor, the captive and the chief. They were bound, not by chains or by laws, but by a love that had been forged in fire, and grief, and blood. It was a love that was stronger than any hate. It was not a cage. It was the only true freedom either of them had ever known. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know what you think. Please, comment below, and let us all know where in the world you are listening from. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the channel, Wild West Tales. Give this video a like, and hit that hype button to help this story reach more listeners.